Let's look at how we can introduce simple form validation into our form that we included in the contact component. This is pure client-side form validation to check to see if the user has input the values in a suitable manner. To continue with this exercise, going into the contact component, let me also import the form feedback component from React Strap. And that will help us to show any error messages to the user within the form. Now, for the form itself, I will use another property here called touched, which will keep track of whether a particular field has been touched or not. Now, only 4 fields from my form will be validated in this exercise. I'm just using this to illustrate to you how you can set up form validation. So I'm going to demonstrate only for 4 fields here: first name, last name, telnum, and email. Now, in the touched, we will store a Boolean value to indicate whether that particular input value has been touched or not. The reason for tracking this is that if the form value has not even been touched by the user has made no changes to that form value, then you should not be validating it at all. Only after the user makes the first change to any of the input boxes, then you can validate that particular input box. So here we are tracking the state for each of the input boxes. So for the first name, initially it is false, last name false, telnum. So all these 4 are false. Whenever for the first time the user modifies the input box corresponding to each of them, then the corresponding value will be set to true. So how do we handle that part? To handle that part, we will introduce one more method here called as handle blur. The handle blur will indicate which particular field has been modified. So this will also receive the corresponding event in here. So when that happens, all that we'll do is we'll set the corresponding touched value So see the use of ... So to say all those. So whatever is the current state, to that I'm going to modify only that particular field. So and set that to true. So whichever particular input box has been modified, that I am going to set that to true. So that way we will be able to track which input box has been modified. So the blur, each input box has the on blur, which will be invoked whenever the first time or whenever anything changes in that input box. So the handle blur will ensure that for that particular field, the touched value of that field in here, in the state here, will be set to true here. So that's the handle blur that we implement. Furthermore, we will validate the form each time the form is re-rendered. So we'll implement a function called validate, which will take in the current values of the 4 fields: first name, last name, telnum, and email. And then we will construct a JavaScript object called errors, which will contain the message corresponding to the 4 values. So let me just copy the first name, last name, telnum, and email from here. These 4. We'll construct an errors object in which those 4 fields initially will be empty strings, but then if there is an error, that particular value will be set to the corresponding error message there. So in here, let's do some validation. Let me show you some validation that I can do. So for the first one, we'll say if this state touched first name. So if the first name has been touched and first name dot length is less than 3, so if the user has typed in a value with less than 3 characters into the first name, then we'll say errors dot first name is first name should be greater than or equal to 3 characters. So now you see how you're setting an error message there. If the first name length field is less than 3, then we'll set that to 3 characters. Else, we are checking to see the length of the first name and last name field. Else, if first name dot length is greater than 10. So you see that we want our first name field to be between 3 and 10 characters. Of course, these are configurable, so you can always change that value in the validation field to whatever value you want to set it to. So we'll say first name should be less than or equal to 10 characters. So that is how we'll validate the first name. So the first name should be between 3 and 10 characters for this particular form. Now you can choose whatever numbers that you want for your particular form, but this is just an illustration. Now similarly for the last name, I'm going to copy that part and then we'll say last name dot length errors last name should be, and then make sure that you change everything correctly, otherwise you will see problems in your code. And if you forget to change one of these first names to last name by copying that, then you will end up changing the wrong fields there. So this is how we check the first name and the last name. So we are ensuring the first name and the last name is between 3 and 10 characters. For the telephone number, what kind of check do I want to do? For the telephone number, I will check to see if the telephone number is a set of numbers only and does not include any other characters. So here I am using a regular expression here. So we'll say #d plus $. Now if you know how regexes work, you understand what I'm doing here. So that is the regular expression. So this regular expression says that all the characters, a string of characters, should be all numbers, nothing else. So that's what we are specifying here. So how do we test this? So we'll say if this state touched telnum and not reg test. So the reg test is a built-in method for the regular expression there. And so the reg test says if you give it a string there, it will return a Boolean value which performs the search and indicates whether the pattern exists in the string or not. So that's what we are doing here. Reg.test. So if you define a regular expression like that, then you can perform such test on that. So you'll test to see if this particular string follows what you specified in the regular expression or not. In this case, this string should be all numbers between 0 and 9, nothing else. So that's the validation test that I'm doing on the telephone number. So we'll say tel number should contain only numbers. That's a meaningful test for telephone number, right? So again, you can create many such tests. You can do a lot more validation. You can even check to see that the telephone number is exactly a certain number of numbers by using the previous kind of test to check the length of the string. So those can be done too, but I'm leaving that as an exercise for you to try on your own. So you can set up to say the telephone number should be exactly 8 numbers or 12 numbers, depending on what is followed in your country as the standard for telephone numbers. For the email, what am I going to test? So for the email, I'll say if this state touched email and email split. So this is again a way of checking to see So here I am checking to see if there is an @ character in your email or not. So I'm checking bit by bit every part of your string to check if each of the characters is at least one of the characters is an @ sign or not. If it is not, then that is not a valid email. So that's what we are checking to make sure. Okay, so not equal to 1, then we'll say errors.email. Email should contain a @ sign. So this is the simple validation that I'm doing on my 4 fields in my form there. That's about it. And then after I do this, then from this function I'll return the errors field. So this validate function, when it is invoked with the first name, last name, tel number, and email, will test those and then tell me whether there are any errors or not. Now, where do we invoke this? We will invoke this in the render function here, because every time there is a change in your input fields, your form will be re-rendered, and so that would be the appropriate time for you to carry out the check. So in the render, we'll say const errors equal to this validate this state first name, last name, tel num, email in that order. So we'll supply the current values of the first name, last name, tel num, and email to the validate function, and if there is an error in any one of them, the errors string that is, or errors object that is returned from here will contain the error message in the corresponding strings in here. Okay, so how do we make use of this? Now within our form, for each of these, so going down to the form here, for each of these inputs, I can also include another field here called form feedback. Now this form feedback will display whatever I am supplying there right at the bottom, just below that field there. So here I'll say form feedback errors dot first name. Let me just put it on the same line there. So that is how we will display the first name. So this is Bootstrap's way of doing things, and so React also supports that. So this will be displayed as a string right below this input box here. So form feedback. Similarly for the last name. We'll say this errors dot last name, and then for the telephone number, errors dot telnum, and then finally for the email also. Now you're saying, what about the rest? Why didn't you introduce validation? You can do that, no doubt, but I'm just illustrating some examples of how to do that. You can extend this exercise further to do validation for the remaining ones based on what is it that you want that field to be validated to. But I've just shown you how you can achieve that. So that is the form feedback. Now also, remember that we want to check to ensure that a field has been touched. So when a field is touched, we will be invoking the handle blur. So how do we invoke the handle blur? So going into each of the fields in the form there, just like we did the on change, we will also invoke the on blur. And within the on blur, we'll say this handle blur, and then we will indicate the corresponding field that we are validating. Okay, so we will say on blur this handle blur first name. So that will invoke the corresponding on blur method. Now the same thing, I'm going to do this for the remaining ones also. So for the last name, so this will ensure that the handle blur is invoked. So this is the handle blur that we have just implemented up here, the handle blur function that we have implemented here. And remember to tie this handle blur this handle blur bind this. Don't forget to do that here. So we need to tie in this handle blur also. So we have now, again going back to the form, I have invoked the handle blur for the first name, the last name, then we'll invoke that for the telnum and also for the email. Not only that, for each of these 4 fields, I will also set the valid flag for each of these, so that if this field is not valid, then the corresponding error will be set appropriately. So for doing this, we'll say valid. So this field is a valid field if errors.firstName is an empty string. Otherwise, this is an invalid field. So we'll set the invalid first name not equal to empty string. So these two also. This will ensure that the valid or the invalid attribute for the input field will be set based upon this error here for the first name. Similarly, for the last name, you see how much effort goes into setting up all the fields here. So for the last name, similarly coming down to the telephone number, and then also for the email. That is it. Now my form has been set up for doing all that validation. Let's save the changes and go and take a look at our form. Going to our form and contact page, now you see that all these are green in color. Let me just type. Now, the moment first time I will have to click outside the box in order to invoke that, and then you immediately see the error there. But the moment I type the third character, that error is gone. Now you see how the long string name error is being invoked like that. And similarly, if I go down below 0, you would see the error name. So that's how the first name is being invoked. Same thing with the last name also. You would see that when I type in just 2 characters, that error field will be displayed, and then if I type in a meaningful name, it'll not show an error. Now for the contact telephone number, you see that if I type in any character other than numbers, then it shows an error. So if I type in numbers, then there is no error. So the regular expression is being verified correctly. For the email, you see the error immediately. But the moment I type in, I mean, you can have an even more complex validation for the email. You could even check to see that it should have dot and then characters after that. But that I will leave that as an exercise for you to pursue further. I'm showing you the basic way of doing validation. With this, we complete this exercise where we have seen simple form validation being introduced into our controlled form. This is a good time for you to do a git commit with the message controlled form validation.